Hi, I'm Dr. Natalie Sambhi, Senior Policy Fellow with Asia Society Australia and Executive Director of Verve Research. I'm the co-author of a new report on Maritime Southeast Asia's decision-making amidst US-China armed conflict in the Indo-Pacific. My co-author, Big Tran, and I examine five countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Vietnam, to go beyond the usual questions of how will Southeast Asia choose between the US and China. We wanted to look at different domestic factors, the formal structures and informal structures of decision making, and things that would help deepen and give us a nuanced understanding of our new region. So the following conversation is a deep dive on one of those five countries, Indonesia, with my friend and colleague, Peter Pandie. All right, well, thanks very much for joining us. Today, my guest is Peter Pandie, who's a researcher in the International Relations Department at CSIS Indonesia, a think tank based in Jakarta. Prior to joining CSIS, Peter worked for the special staff to the President of Indonesia, and his research interests include Indonesian foreign and defense policy, great power relations, perfect for today's discussion, as well as regional security dynamics. Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, just as a refresher to our audience, we're going to be talking about our newly released report on maritime Southeast Asian states and how they will respond to major power conflict between the US and China in the Indo-Pacific. So, Peter, thanks for joining me to talk about Indonesia's dynamics. When we look at the leadership of today under President Prabowo Subianto, is conflict between the US and China high on the list, or what are the other major security concerns?
I would say it is high on the list, but given Indonesia's sort of historical civil-military relations and how the security apparatus has functioned in the country, I think a lot of internal security considerations are also top of the mind, especially now under this administration. Security apparatuses such as the TNI and the police are increasingly more involved in non-defense or non-security related activities, such as energy security, food security, the president's flagship free lunch program, and so on and so forth. So while I do think it is increasingly higher on the list in this regard, U.S.-China conflict, the practices on the ground reveal certain realities that are contrary to narratives that are that the fact that geopolitical conflict is high on the list. With that being said, I have seen a few initiatives, like recently, our Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs, Hafaz, has been writing and speaking a lot about maritime conflict, the potential for sea denial, and so on and so forth, which I think is an interesting sort of turn in narration or policy focus on how Indonesia plans to position itself in wartime. Kemlu has also worked quite closely and focused a little bit on what would happen in a sort of Taiwan contingency, right? So I think that's also high on the list in regards to, I think the report alludes to it as well, due to Indonesia's high number of migrant workers in Taiwan. So I think that is also high on the list. So I think the answer is a bit complicated, given the fact that, a lot of different political focuses, where the TNI is, and the security apparatus is focused on, as well as increasing shortening space of geopolitical conflict in the region.
I want to come back to security actors in a moment. I just want to go a little bit further on your point just now raised about the Deputy Foreign Minister, uh, Papa Hafaz. How much do you think that's influenced by what's been happening with the Strait of Hormuz lately? How much has that changed the consideration amongst Indonesia's decision makers?
I think significantly, right? I think the Strait of Hormuz has shown that number one, choke points are in geography are a big part of conflict, and I think considerations for what would happen in a conflict scenario to the Strait of Malacca, to Lombok Sunda Strait, or the Malacca Strait has been high on some policymakers' list for a number of years now, especially in consideration to what would happen if a conflict broke out in the Taiwan Straits or the South China Sea, and what that would mean for Indonesia's territorial waters. And we just saw that in practice in the Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East. So I think for some policymakers, it is top of mind to sort of think about these scenarios and how Indonesia would respond both diplomatically, legally, and militarily or politically in such a scenario. What capabilities exist to fulfill the aspirations or keep Indonesia safe or neutral or not aligned in any sort of situation, I think is top of mind for a lot of policymakers. I really do think that the Strait of Hormuz has been sort of almost a wake up call for a lot of policymakers, not just in Jakarta, but elsewhere. As you say, right, you don't waste a good crisis. You don't want to walk away from a crisis and not learn anything or prepare anything for the next one. So I think that's what a lot of people are thinking back home.
I mean, as a think tanker and researcher, have you had more interest in discussing this with policymakers or other people within the foreign policy strategic community since the war in Iran?
I believe so. So there's been a lot of discussions in regards to what Indonesia, um, what can be learned from the Strait of Hormuz conflict. Obviously, energy security is top of mind in that regard. But also, I think there's been increasing discussions on the military side of things and how sort of we can prepare our military doctrine in preparation for any sort of conflict scenario in our regional waters. Not necessarily copying exactly the Iranian strategy or what's been happening in the Middle East, because obviously there are different legal diplomatic contexts. Of course, Indonesia is a party to UNCLOS. We're very much adhering to international maritime law, so the context is very much different. But I do think there are some things that can be drawn, and what policymakers are trying to draw from the conflict. I think it is important to distinct as well the different political context between the two sides, between the two scenarios. Indonesia, very much so, throughout his history has been adherent and inherent to international maritime law. So I think that does add a layer of complexity and sort of what we need to do as far as holding on to our principles and values in our foreign policy when thinking of scenario conflicts such as this.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that form's definitely a part of Indonesia's foreign policy culture as well. I just want to
Yeah.
pivot back to your first statement about the different factors that are going on, the different things that are shaping Indonesian decision makers when it comes to thinking about security. And as you know, one of the main aims of our report that Dr. Biktran and I did was to put the focus back on domestic factors, to put agency back onto Southeast Asia. How do Southeast Asian states look at the security terrain and to think beyond just a binary between the US and China? So, as you know, in our report, we identified things like domestic security concerns. You talked about internal security actors as well. We identified a number of other factors, including decision-making structures. Now that you've had a chance to have a look at the report, I just wanted to get your reaction to the factors that we identified in conflict decision making. Is there anything that we missed out? Is there anything you think that our audience should pay particular attention to?
I think you touched on a lot of very, very important points. So I think I'll repeat some of the points that you already mentioned in the report, but I think military capabilities or our ongoing modernization process of our military capabilities is one of the sort of constraints, I think, in facing any sort of conflict scenario, especially when we consider conflict scenarios such as a Taiwan contingency. I think it's been repeated quite often that given the number of Indonesian migrants and ASEAN migrants as a whole in Taiwan, it would be quite difficult for us to, given our current military capabilities and naval capabilities, to evacuate all of them safely. So I think constraints in that regard, as far as hard material capabilities, are already top of mind. In addition to a number of efficiencies that have been going on in a number of Indonesian programs, due to flagship programs such as the free lunch program, is also top of mind for a lot of policymakers and researchers in the community, as well, as far as whether there'd be enough budget in a lot of key and lead agencies in a time of crisis to actually address the crisis in a proper manner. So I think budget, hard capabilities and material capabilities, as well as investment into regional security architectures under ASEAN, I think has also been a little lacking under this administration, which also deserves a significant degree of attention as well. So, early warning mechanisms, crisis prevention management mechanisms under ASEAN frameworks or others, I think also deserve significant attention, but has not. I think that also comes into mind for a lot of policymakers, especially at Kamloo and elsewhere.
Yeah, so just to sum up what you said just now, there are domestic priorities such as free meals program under the current administration. But
Yeah.
looking more broadly, things such as resources. I think you put it very diplomatically just now when you said efficiencies, when we really want to say budget cuts. So looking at
Yes.
the internal resources, constraints, and or capabilities of a country. Yeah, and so those are important factors as well. Um, often we look at the state of Southeast Asia. You mentioned ASEAN just now as an important regional body, but we also know that it plays an important part as an epicenter of a lot of regional architecture as well. And there's an important role for partners of that architecture to play, including Australia. Where does Australia factor into any kind of conflict within the Indo-Pacific within Indonesian policymakers' imagination?
Well, to be very, very frank, I think in the minds of a lot of Indonesian policymakers is that there is a fear that Australia would be involved in such a conflict, let's say in a South China Sea or a Taiwan contingency, The fear is that, our waters, Indonesian waters, would be somehow involved in sort of any conflict scenario where, naval assets from Australia or elsewhere will be passing through Indonesian waters to reach the South China Sea or others. But in my personal view, I think there is some role to play for Australia as a stabilizing force, where I think the strategic thinking in Jakarta and Australia and Canberra is not always on the same page, and that's a given different strategic cultures and that the fact that we're neighbors. But I do think there is a common interest in keeping regional stability and peace and stability within the region and avoiding conflict at all costs. So I think increasing dialogue and having these sort of joint crisis coordination mechanisms, I think, is very important between Indonesia, ASEAN, and Australia, and in sort of investing in those capabilities and mechanisms so as to prevent conflict as much as possible. I think when conflict does erupt, it's quite difficult to imagine what sort of scenario would play out. But I think even in the sort of activities that we did for this report, there was a lot of discussion with Australia in the scenario that we played, where Australia would be sort of a connector for ASEAN countries to countries such as the United States to sort of begin peace talks or some sort of talks to reduce tension. So I think there is a really, really important role that can be played by Canberra in that regard, especially during peacetime, right? Because in wartime, a lot of factors can become quite unpredictable, and it's quite difficult to see what sort of role can be played. But I think in peacetime, it's definitely a big role that Canberra can play as far as working together with Indonesia and ASEAN to ensure that the region remains stable and peace for all parties involved.
So you raised some interesting points there about Australia supporting Southeast Asian states, particularly during peacetime. Is there more that Australia can do with ASEAN itself?
I do think I do have to give some kudos to colleagues at the Australian Embassy in Jakarta, as well as colleagues at DFAT. I do think Australia has been very, very active as far as working together with ASEAN on conflict prevention. I do think a lot of the homework remains to be done within at least the Indonesian administration and ASEAN at large. I can speak from a Jakarta context that I do think a lot of the criticism has been gone to the way of the Prabowo administration and the lack of their sort of investment into ASEAN mechanisms. Dialogue partners can only do so much if ASEAN members or Jakarta does not move towards improving or investing in ASEAN itself. So I think Australia has done a very, very impressive job at investing and engaging with ASEAN, at least in Jakarta, as far as I know, in having dialogues, roundtables, having discussions on where to go with these conflict prevention mechanisms. As I do think it's been high on the list for Penny Wong as far as she's been FM. If the question is what more Australia can do, I think Australia has done a lot, and Australia has done very well. So I do think a lot of the homework remains with Jakarta at this point. So, getting our act together and investing in ASEAN as we should and as we must, given the importance of the regional association to regional peace and stability. So, bit of a tough question there. Kudos to Australia, but yeah, unfortunately, I think we need to push Jakarta a little more to do more there, to put their end of the bargain.
I mean, you mentioned earlier the scenario. So, just for our audience, Peter was one of our participants in our workshop simulation last year in October in Singapore, playing in the Indonesia team. It's a different kind of way of allowing people to discuss these issues in a much more interactive way. For you, what was the benefit of coming to Singapore and wargaming out these scenarios playing Team Indonesia?
Right. So I do think scenario exercises such as this are very, very important to sort of see what sort of things can happen or how people would react representing their countries in sort of a crisis or a high stakes scenario. Since that scenario event, we at CSIS and others have also worked on a lot of scenario play as well in regards to a trade crisis, Taiwan contingency, and so on and so forth. So I do think it's really, really helpful to give policymakers and researchers a chance to see what sort of options you have when a crisis does evolve, right? You want to build your scenario so that things are compounding, the things, the factors are, the space for you to move gets smaller and smaller, the stakes get higher, and so on. So it gives you a bigger picture of how your country or your team would have reduced amount of doors that you can go through. So I do think there is a really, really significant value as far as really seeing opportunities sort of go away, and then how other countries would react and give you sort of out of the box ideas at times, and engage with other countries in a sort of a safe space where you can try out ideas, policy ideas that you can think of on the spot without having the sort of same sort of stakes when you have in the real world. So I do think it's a really, really important exercise, not just for stress testing existing crisis response mechanisms, but also for thinking of out of the box ideas in the moment, what you can do to respond to the crisis scenario that you're given. So really well done on that.
No, well, I'm glad you came to participate. It was really important to get people from countries that they were playing to come and share with us their thoughts and elements of their strategic culture as well. So, my last question today, you know that our report is not supposed to be a predictive model of these states'
Mm,
behaviors. It's hard to account for all the different variables, but it's a blueprint of where to look and how to understand countries in Southeast Asia. So, thinking about the target audience of our report really are practitioners. What should practitioners know about Indonesia when they are going to develop engagement strategies?
Hmm. Yeah, that is a tougher question to answer because, on the one hand, I would say that this administration in particular is very, very puts a significant emphasis on security and defense bilateral ties. As we've seen with the Prabowo administration, a significant amount of defense deals and defense talks have been done by this administration with its bilateral partners, Australia being one of them. I think since Prabowo has come into power, we've signed two agreements, the Treaty on Common Security and the upgraded DCA. And with other countries as well. We've signed a number of procurement deals, upgraded defense ties, and so on. So on that end, I would say that practitioners should know that there is significant emphasis and desire for upgrading defense ties on a number of different dimensions. With that being said, I do think what practitioners should keep in mind is that Jakarta has a lot of different political focuses and a lot of flagship programs that can be challenging to address when you only have so much fiscal space and resources, right? As I said, this is back again to the number of significantly fiscally demanding programs and resource demanding and human resource demanding, such as the flagship free meals program, which the president has increasingly involved the TNI in. So I do think there is a bit of a mismatch in wanting to have a significant focus on military, but not always on defense roles for the military. So a lot of food security, energy security roles. On that front, I do think modernization, procurement, defense dialogues, officer exchange, which I think is being worked with Australia as well, is something that the administration is excited and willing to do. So on that front, I think exploring a lot of these confidence building measures, officer exchanges, increasing mill-to-mill ties, procurement where possible, I think can be done under this administration. With that being said, I do think the sort of traditional apprehension towards traditional alliances is still very much present in Indonesia. Um, Being given the culture of non-alignment, wanting to avoid sort of close military pacts or alliances are still thick within the strategic culture in Indonesia, even though there is more excitement to do more of these defense deals. As far as procurement or who we get to work with, I think one thing that we practitioners outside Jakarta should keep in mind is that regardless of the administration, Jakarta will likely always pursue a more diversified portfolio of who it wants to engage with. Prabowo has called it, his 1,000 friends, zero enemies sort of foreign policy framework. And I guess something that gets cited a lot is as an evidence of this diversification is our procurement portfolio. We've procured from a number of different countries, the US, the Russians in times past, the French, the Turkish. I think some defense deals are in talks right now with Japan as well. South Korea is another. So I think friends in a lot of places, a diversified portfolio of procurement and defense engagements is a given that Indonesia does not want to sort of have over-reliance on a single partner or supplier of arms. So I think those three things, domestic resource constraints, sort of excitement for more defense deals, but at the same time pursuing a diversified portfolio of engagement as far as defense goes, is I think top three, I would say, practitioners should keep in mind when developing strategies to engage Jakarta.
Yep, certainly. There are some structural factors there and some enduring ones. And then there are ones that are
Yep.
peculiar to this particular administration. So it's very, very
Yep.
helpful, Peter. Thank you so much for helping to shed a bit more light on Southeast Asia's largest state, one that's proximate to very important strategic maritime routes that will become critical in the event of any kind of conflict. To our audience, if you haven't already, go online to Asia Society Australia's website and check out our latest report. And Peter, thank you so much again for joining us. And we hope to continue the conversation another time as well.
Thank you for having me.